You're watching the Conservative Talks, brought to you by the ECR Party, your weekly Q&A show on the deeper themes driving the European news cycle. I'm your host, Jorge Gonzalez-Galarza. Every week, an expert roster of authors, lawmakers, and newsmakers will join me to unpack the events rocking the European Union's foundations in a short, digestible format from a conservative and Euro-realist angle. Welcome to another episode of our series. Today, we are very happy to be talking to Sam Hall, who is joining us from the UK. Sam is an experienced Westminster and Whitehall hand, worked at several places in London, Westminster, and several think tanks and government departments over the years. He was head of research at Bright Blue, which is a think tank. He was a policy advisor to Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State for the Environment, but most importantly, now he is the director of a fascinating organization called the Conservative Environment Network, CEN. And Sam is joining us today to discuss conservative environmentalism and some of the work that his organization is up to on that front. Moving the needle, so to speak, on UK public opinion and trying to change the conversation and the way that the public perceives environmentalism. And the way I wanted to get started here, Sam, is just by stating the obvious. For a lot of our audience, they'll be aware that for decades the environment was a monopoly of the left, right? It was almost taken for granted that the right didn't really have standing in the environmental sort of conversation, right? Your organization, CEN, you're not only are you a sort of a thought leadership hub where you put out very interesting literature and papers, but you're also a caucus of MPs that lobby quite heavily the government for certain environmental policies. And I wanted to get started by asking you kind of over the recent years how you see the climate of opinion in the UK, whether you think that as conservatives we're doing a good job of convincing the public that there is a plausible case to be made that conservatives can conserve the environment and move towards a greener economy.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me on, Jorge. It's a pleasure to be on your webinar. Absolutely, I do think we are making progress, but I'd like to start by saying that I do think we have a heritage of concern for the environment within conservatism. It was Margaret Thatcher that made the first major international speech at the UN warning of the dangers of climate change. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan both led the international campaign to tackle chlorofluorocarbons. They were causing a hole in the ozone layer to appear. So I do think that there is a long-standing heritage actually within conservatism that is associated with concern for the environment. I think we as conservatives have forgotten about that for a couple of intervening decades, and I think the public haven't associated the environment with conservatism. But nonetheless, I think there has been that tradition, and a big part of what we're trying to do at CEN is to try and remind conservatives of that aspect of their intellectual and political heritage. But I definitely think we are making progress. Recent UK Conservative Prime Ministers have done lots of great things on the environment. So Theresa May made the UK the first major economy to set in law a net zero emissions target for 2050. She embarked us on a journey as well of reforming farm subsidies. So as a result of leaving the EU, we're ending the system of area-based payments, which are economically inefficient, environmentally damaging, and wasteful, and instead we're going to be using that money to reward farmers for environmental benefits. So things like planting more hedgerows, planting more trees, restoring peatland, etc. So she has a very strong legacy, and under Boris Johnson that has continued and accelerated, I would say. So we've got a major piece of environmental legislation at the moment going through Parliament, the Environment Bill, which sets new legally binding targets for the natural environment. It's creating a new environmental watchdog, and there's lots of great provisions in. For example, local nature recovery plans are going to be set up through it, a new duty on developers to improve biodiversity. So yeah, there's lots of policy making going on. And a few months ago, Boris Johnson, as part of his thinking for how to reboot the economy post-COVID, announced this 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which sets the UK off to be leaders in technologies like carbon capture, hydrogen production, offshore wind, and so on. So there's a real energy, I think, at the moment behind the government's environmental work. I think that is, filtering through to Parliament and indeed the public. So we have a caucus, a backbench caucus of Conservative MPs and peers. When I started at SEN a year and a half ago, that was around 40 members of Parliament. It's now getting near 100. With this new intake of MPs that have come in since the last election, we've seen a massive increase in the environment. And it was a big factor at the most recent general election in the UK as well. It was one of Boris Johnson's top 5 pledges, was delivering his net zero targets. It featured a lot in the public debate around the election as well. So yes, I think we are starting to make progress. Obviously, there's more to do. We're still not making the progress we need to as a planet, as a country, on tackling our environmental challenges. But yeah, I think we are starting to assert some Conservative ownership of this topic, which is very welcome.
That's fantastic, and a really broad overview of some of the work you're doing, and a great way to get right into the heart of it. As we were discussing just offline, I think one of the things that really strikes people on both sides of the channel on the UK in the UK, but also in Europe, is kind of seeing Brexit as an opportunity for the kind of environmental agenda, which you've just outlined some of the tenets under Boris Johnson's government, the opportunity for that to be a different kind of environmentalism, right? More in line with the things that you advocate for. I mean, on our side of the channel, we're seeing a far more heavy-handed approach. We've seen the European Green Deal, which perhaps we didn't really see that sort of policy area play much of a role in the Brexit referendum. And I think as the years have gone by since, people are really waking up to the very ambitious environmental agenda that the European Commission on our side is pushing forth. So could you maybe delve a little deeper into some of the specific policy priorities of this current government? You've alluded to the 10-point strategy that Boris has outlined. Perhaps we can maybe start by kind of alluding to some of the electoral politics. We saw Boris with a very strong pitch to the north of England, with a sort of a leveling up strategy. And on a prima facie level, you could almost think that would worry a lot of people. I know that the UK has had a process of deindustrialization for many decades, but still some of the kind of the dirtier, so to speak, industries are located in that part of the country. So that could have been a worrying sign. And yet Boris has come out with this plan that you mentioned. And can you maybe, apart from the electoral politics, how that's playing out, can you maybe delve into some of the specific policy areas and how they're breaking ground for a different kind of environmentalism that relies more heavily on free market mechanisms to deliver reduction of emissions and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so touching first on the electoral politics. So at the last general election in the UK, we saw quite a big shift in the Conservative voter base. So that what is called in the jargon the red wall, these seats which have historically been held by Labour, many of them in former coal mining communities, were won for the first time by the Conservatives. And a large part of that was to do with Brexit. These voters supported Brexit. They wanted to see Brexit delivered, felt that the previous Parliament had kind of delayed and tried to obstruct this, and so wanted Boris Johnson as Prime Minister to make sure that got delivered. But I think as a result, we have seen a shift in priorities and focus of the government's environmental agenda. So I think now in this Parliament, it is much more about green jobs. Because as you say, these communities are sort of the former industrial heartlands of England and the rest of the UK. They're places that once had lots of industry, from steel making to coal mining. Now lots of those jobs have gone with globalisation and other factors. And I think Boris Johnson sees the green industrial revolution as a chance to reindustrialise those parts of the country. And there are lots of strength that they have, to deliver technologies that we're going to need to solve climate change. Things like carbon capture, the production of hydrogen, the developing of offshore wind. So to give an example, in the northeast of England, there is now a massive turbine factory just outside of Hull, which is making these massive turbines that are going out into the North Sea and making up the UK's offshore wind farm fleet, which is the largest installed capacity of any country in the world. There are a coastal community, a town called Grimsby, which again has been revitalised by the jobs that come from servicing those offshore wind farms. So, you know, this strategy, I think, is already starting to reap rewards, and I think it will continue to do so, because there are these, as I say, carbon capture, hydrogen, which are at a much earlier stage, and those I think offer lots of promise for those areas. I mean, in terms of policy mechanisms, I think, you know, what we're seeing at the moment is a big focus on early stage development and deployment. So I think that a conservative approach is to back R&D in clean technologies, and I think that is what we're doing. I think once we've developed a sort of demonstrators of how these technologies can come online, you know, we need to be designing market mechanisms that will get private capital investing in hydrogen production, in carbon capture. And the government recently released an energy white paper with some ideas on how to do that. I mean, to give an example, I think the offshore wind sector has been developed very successfully with this contracts for difference mechanism. So these are contracts, government-backed contracts, which guarantee a fixed price for energy generated from new renewable projects, and what they're auctioned off in the first instance. So there's competition between different projects, each bidding to provide the power at the lowest possible cost to consumer. You've got lots of innovation coming in off the back of them, because there's this certainty for investors about the minimum return they're going to get from those projects. They have the confidence to invest in their supply chains, to invest in building bigger, better turbines that are able to generate more electricity. So I think this approach, you know, this market-based approach, has worked really well in offshore wind, and I think that sort of approach we can see it in hydrogen and carbon capture as well. But just one final point on this. I think one of the most exciting things for me about what we can do outside the EU, and this is something that I worked on a lot when I was in DEFRA, which I think contrasts quite strongly with what's happening in Europe at the moment, is farm subsidy reform, which I mentioned earlier. So there's £3 billion a year at the moment spent in the UK on the sort of legacy of the common agricultural policy. Largely wasted money, creates perverse incentives for farmers to scrub out hedgerows and rip out trees from the land, farm more intensively in a way that depletes nature in our soil and carbon in our soil and so on. Whereas what the UK government has embarked on doing is shifting that funding towards environmental benefits. And as a sort of parallel, at the same time, the European Commission, despite trying its best to get member states to agree to a more, to remove some of those subsidies and make them more about environmental payments, has faced big pushback from some of the member states and isn't embarking on a similar vision of farm subsidy reform. But, you know, to me, that is one of the things that, you know, green free marketeers should be most championing. You know, we don't like subsidies for obvious reasons. You know, they distort markets. There's an excessive government intervention in the markets. So shifting that money away from economically harmful and environmentally harmful subsidies towards environmental payments is a win-win for the environment and for the free market. And I think, yeah, in the UK we are blazing a trail on that, and I hope that other countries will look at the success of it and will hope to follow it.
This is really fascinating, and it gives a really wide set of examples of what the UK is doing specifically to blaze that trail in a more free market direction. And it's such an important paradigm shift when you look at the issue that way, which is the way that the left does not want us to think about the issue on either side of the channel, is by posing the question not in terms of do you have an environmental policy or do you not, but what kind of environmental policy do you have, and how do you fashion it so that the dynamics of the market aren't hampered and instead channeled in a pro-environment direction. So I really appreciate you laying all that out. But I'm really interested precisely on the role of kind of science and the role that Sen gives to science and kind of fashioning its policy agenda, and it's the way that you interact with MPs and things of that nature. one thing that really struck me when I started reading literature by Sen was that you do not engage whatsoever in any of your own research, right? If I understand correctly, the kind of the research that goes into informing your policy proposals and your policy agenda is entirely the product of other people's research that is peer reviewed. And the reason I'm really curious to have you delve into some of this is because when you look at, for instance, in other countries, primarily in the US, when free market environmentalist groups have engaged in their own research, they've been very quickly labeled as corporate funded climate denialists. And whereas you take a different tack to this and you turn to the experts and the peer reviewed research that is out there and use that to inform your policy proposals. So can you delve deeper into kind of how you work, and perhaps maybe also into how, into whether that is the reason why you're having such interest in the Commons and elsewhere?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing to stress about SEN is that we're a network. So there are think tanks which are there to produce policy papers, do original research, do original data analysis. What we're much more about is bringing Conservatives together, facilitating discussions, finding the common ground, and then amplifying Conservative voices in the debate. So we're not experts in climate science or natural sciences. We rely on others who are much, who've got PhDs and decades of research experience to do that work. And so, our starting premise is that, climate change, man-made climate change is a very serious threat. We need to take urgent action to tackle it. Similarly, biodiversity, is in crisis at the moment. Up to 3/4 of global animal populations have declined in recent decades, potentially 1 million species about to go extinct. All those facts are kind of our starting point, and we try and make other Conservatives aware of them and try and encourage them to put forward constructive solutions. I think, going back to something you mentioned in one of your introductions earlier, I think that sometimes in sort of Conservative environmentalist groups, you get a lot of time spent criticizing left-wing solutions and not enough time proposing constructive alternatives. And I think that is something that I'm keen to do through SEN. But definitely as part of being a network, we are a broad church, so we try not to focus on particular strands of Conservative thinking or strands within the Conservative movement in the UK. There are going to be some very free market people. There's going to be what is in the UK context, I suppose, more referred to as kind of one nation Conservatives who are more comfortable with levels of state intervention in the economy. And we at SEN try and encompass all of them. Brexit's another good example. Again, there are people, very strong Brexiteers in the SEN caucus, and there are people that campaign very strongly for Remain. Now, I hope that after the last election, that distinction is more moot than it used to be. But nonetheless, I think it is really important at SEN that we are the umbrella group for Conservatives of all different shades. And that, again, is another reason why we try not to be do original research and put out our own very distinctive proposals, because I think inevitably we would end up alienating different strands within Conservatism. I want us to be the broad church where we can host those debates between the kind of free marketeers and the one nation Conservatives and any other different factions within Conservatism, and we can hopefully try and find the common ground and drive the agenda forward. So that's how we work. And a final point, actually, though, we obviously, a lot of what we do is nationally focused in Westminster, but we do have a councillor network as well. So we try and bring Conservative councillors in local government together, so that in the UK, the Conservatives are the largest party in local government. We control the most councils. Councils have a hugely important role to play in tackling environmental challenges. And, as Conservatives as well, I think we instinctively like the idea of locally led, decentralised solutions to environmental challenges. So what we try and do is bring them together and share case studies, because sometimes one council might be doing something really great on renewable energy, another on waste management, and by sharing those ideas, we can encourage other councils to adopt sort of best practice, if you like. And then finally, international. So we're doing this year, in the run up to the big UN climate summit, COP26 in Glasgow, lots of convening of Conservatives from different countries, where we're trying to again provide a forum for Conservatives to compare notes. And again, there's a lot of differences inevitably between countries. I mean, in the UK, we don't have much coal mining anymore, whereas some of the countries we're talking to, like Canada and Australia, do have really strong coal industries. So they've got different electoral politics and different challenges in terms of how they're going to need to approach climate change. But I think there's something valuable about being able to get Conservatives talking about climate change to each other, and again learning and being inspired by what other Conservatives are doing on climate change, and hopefully again finding where the consensus is, because yeah, we do have these global climate goals, the Paris Agreement goals, to try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and well below 2 degrees, and so we all need to be trying to work towards that. And I think, yeah, bringing Conservatives together and making a kind of more united, constructive Conservative voice, these international summits, I think, is a really valuable thing that we're trying to do as well this year.
Well, that's it's fascinating. We'll surely stay tuned into what the very busy year that you have ahead of you, and particularly ahead of the Glasgow COP26. But I think what you just walked us through really speaks to what kind of organization SEN is, and it really gives it a good kind of description. And I wonder if we can get into some of the longer term issues, perhaps slightly more highbrow or intellectual, if you'd like to call them that. But I think that a huge part of your work, and certainly a huge part of how you present yourself into conservative circles, is by seeking to reclaim the legacy that exists, as we were discussing before going live. And your literature, you just mentioned at the start. Your literature quotes the Margaret Thatcher's 1980, well, towards the late 1980s, the speech she gave at the UN, but also even on a longer term, kind of even deeper level, you do make the very forceful case that there's something inherently conservative about seeking to preserve the natural environment, right? Seeking to endow future generations with an intact natural environment that they can then also enjoy and make use of. And I wonder, kind of back to my initial question, what do you see the needle moving there? Do you think that what's kind of a longer term intellectual tradition that you're trying to revive? We also recently, with the death of the late Sir Roger Scruton, we also had a very high level discussions on conservative environmentalism. Do you think the needle is moving on that specific front? And what is kind of the longer term tradition that you're trying to revive?
Yeah, no, there definitely is a lot of what we try and do is remind, as I said at the start, Conservatives of that heritage, and it's a long heritage. So, one of the first philosophers that we talk about is Edmund Burke, who, is thought of in the UK as a sort of intellectual grandfather of modern conservatism, and he talks about the sort of intergenerational partnership, so the contract between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. And I think one of the most clear instances of where that contract applies is in the environment. Each generation has to hand on to the next, a preserved and ideally enhanced inheritance, environmental inheritance. And this actually is that language of future generations and so on has actually got itself into the Conservative manifesto. So it's been a recurring pledge of Conservative manifestos in recent years. And I think, when we think about what we're trying to do in terms of handing on a safe climate that isn't going to lead to ever worsening floods and rising sea levels and the loss of species as a result of, pests and diseases having larger ranges and so on, that's a very clear instance of us trying to honour that contract. Similarly, biodiversity, we know all these amazing species that are at risk of extinction, which future generations might never get to see. Again, that feels like a very important mission for Conservatives, to try and make sure that we don't lose the wonders of nature, and that we don't hand on a sort of impoverished natural worlds to our children and grandchildren. So yeah, there are lots of areas I think where that principle we're sort of starting to see it being put into place. I mean, as you mentioned as well, the other sort of key thinker for us in this is Sir Roger Scruton, and his sort of phrase that he has of oikophilia, so the love of home, which he claims that is the kind of instinctive conservative principle within us all, the yearning for home, the yearning to belonging, and that leads us to want to take care of our surroundings, of our environment, of our nature. And I think, actually in this period of COVID and lockdowns, where lots of us have been confined to our homes to work and to live, and we spent way more time at home than we normally do, I think that feeling has grown stronger for many of us. Actually, we've spent more time in our local green spaces and visiting local nature reserves. And I think we've realised the kind of respite that we get from nature as well, hearing the bird song and seeing wildflowers and the colour and the beauty of nature. It's provided much needed mental health benefits, I think, to people at an otherwise very anxious time. So I think those traditions, I think, are definitely there in our work, and we try and root the policy asks and the narratives that we try and tell and promote in those principles, because I do think conservatives instinctively get them, and I think there's been a small and thankfully shrinking sort of history of climate skepticism within the conservative movement, which I think has done a lot of damage to sort of the perception of where conservatives stand on the environment. But I do think the reality is that those core principles are there in most conservatives, and we're trying our best to remind them of them and develop sort of policy solutions that are in line with them and sort of give them substance.
It's such a hopeful note to end on. It's been a really wide-ranging discussion, and we're so glad to have to come out of this knowing a lot more about what our British friends are up to on the other side of the pond, and hopefully to see you again as you keep developing the international network that you spoke of earlier. But for now, let me thank you so much, Sam. Sam Hall is the director of the Conservative Environment Network in Westminster. Really, truly a pleasure talking to you today, and hopefully see you at another occasion.
Yes, thank you very much for having me on, Jorge. Pleasure.
That is all the time we have for this episode. If you like what you've watched, stay tuned for future episodes on YouTube and across the ECR Party's social media presence. Thank you.